see, feel free, I'm sorry. Feel free to drop me a line and let me know if you have specific speakers or topics that you would like to have. And now I've got the pleasure of introducing Damon Davis, who will be speaking to us on what he has learned through his almost 200 podcast conversations with mostly adoptees across the country. Damon is an adoptee himself who was reunited with his biological mother in 2009. He had a very heartwarming story that we're, I think, going to hear a little bit about this evening. He's a storyteller at heart who enjoys hearing and sharing the real stories of our lives that make us each who we are. He created the podcast, Who Am I Really?, to help people adopted or who grew up in foster care to explore their own emotions, desires, and questions about reuniting with their biological family and being able to hear other people's stories as well. Damon also wrote a memoir of the same name, which was published in 2019. I almost said last year, it's like we lost a year. To find out more about Damon and his website and his podcast, I'll be putting his website in the chat. And I'll also put in chat a link to more information about his book and maybe a couple other links as we go. So with that, I will hand it over to Damon. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Betsy. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate the invitation to join Adoption Network Cleveland and the Ohio Family Connection. I think I was reading up on some of the work that you guys have been doing for decades in the spaces of advocacy and supporting adoptees and people in foster care and parents of both sides, both birth and adoption. And I just think your work is really amazing. So I'm really grateful to you all for the invitation to address your folks here. And thank you very much for your decades of work. I think it's really amazing. So once again, I'm Damon Davis. I'm the host of the Who Am I Really podcast. And I'm an adopted person. I'm also an adoptive parent. So I have what we think of in the triad, I have two experiences of three. I've never relinquished a child into adoption, but I feel very fortunate for the adoption experience that I did have. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background as to who I am and a bit of my story. Then I'm going to tell you a little bit about how it led to the start of the podcast, because those two things are very much intertwined. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the lessons that I've learned after speaking to between 150 and 200 guests on the show, almost all of whom have been adoptees. So to start with my personal story, I was born in Baltimore, Maryland. I grew up in Columbia, Maryland, about 20 minutes south of there. And I had, a very idyllic life. It's a planned community. I was adopted into a homogenous family where my mother was light-skinned. My dad was dark-skinned. I'm middle ground in terms of Black people. So we looked like family, which was very comfortable for me. But I do recall thinking to myself when I was in high school, I would see parents with children that didn't necessarily look like the child and parent went together. And I would wonder if that person was adopted. So it was around, but I didn't really talk about it much with a lot of people. I was perfectly open about it if it came up, but I wasn't necessarily seeking to speak about adoption. I never really had a desire to search for my biological relatives at all. I always felt like the parents that I had were the parents that I have, and they are my mom and dad. I always used to say, I have two parents. Why would I go look for two more? You know what I mean? And so what ended up happening for me was I got married and we had my son, Seth. And my son, I was at home with him one day by myself, and I'm looking at this little baby. He's laying on his back before me on an ottoman in the living room, and he's kicking and he's waving his hands and feet, and he's trying to figure out his place in the world. And tears came to my eyes because I realized this is the first biological relative I have ever known in my entire life. And it was really a heart-pounding moment for me because that meant that there was really a disconnect from me, from some other people out there that I consider to be relatives that I have no idea who these people are. Some other impactful things happened for me as well. One of which was my father-in-law came to town. We visited one of his relatives who was relatively elderly, and the woman comes to the door and invites us inside. We sit down and she pulls out a box of all kinds of family artifacts. And she's spreading out pictures and articles, and we're passing these artifacts around. And she's telling the story that weaves all of these pieces of their family history together. It was when you were in college, your father was over here doing this. And when your father got married, this happened in the family. And I'm looking at this older woman who's in the autumn of her years, and I'm realizing if I don't find the griot in my family, the family historian who knows where everybody's been and what they've been doing, that person might die. And I might never, ever hear any of these stories. So that was similarly motivational for me in order to try to start the search for my biological mother. The third thing that happened for me was, excuse me, I was experiencing the deterioration of my adopted mother's mental health. She had retired from work. She was home by herself. She had really no plan and no social network. And unfortunately, what I think had been suppressed by the process of going to work every day started to really roar to the forefront. And we were really challenged in our relationship at that time. And it was very unfortunate. And one of my friends said to me, I think you should probably look for your biological mother. Like, I feel like you need this. And I was resistant to it for years, as I had always been. But eventually I relented. I reached out to Baltimore City Social Services. They went and found my records in Maryland's catalog. And we had the meeting where she reads my redacted record to me and she says, I'm going to look for your mother, but I need you to write an introductory letter of yourself to this person in case we ever find her. So I went to work that day, and I often joke, I owe the government some money because I was in government service at that time and I didn't do any work that day. I sat there and I wrote that entire letter word by word. I printed it off and then I sat there and I hand wrote the whole thing. And I did that because I wanted her to have a sample of my handwriting as well as the clarity of my words as I had typed them. And then I sent it off and I dropped the letter in the mailbox and I said, you know what? I haven't thought about this my entire life. I'm not going to start obsessing about it right now. About 2 weeks later, my social worker lead calls me and I said, there's no reason for her to be calling me unless she's got news. And sure enough, she did. She said, I found her. I've read her your letter and she's ecstatic. And it blew my mind because I was expecting that this could be a year-long experience for all I knew. 2, 3, 4 years. I had no idea if they were going to find her. So I ended up getting a reciprocal letter where my birth mother introduced herself to me. And she told me that, she had always thought about me and that she was so grateful that I had reached out. And she expressed a little bit about herself. She told me what her birth date was. And she told me that we had actually attended the same college. We both went to Hampton University, which is a historically Black college in Virginia. She had gone there and I, completely unbeknownst, there's no way I could have known that Hampton was part of my family's history. I had chosen the same school. Turns out Hampton University was actually part of our family in that her father and her uncle had also gone to Hampton. So that school was in the family. It's just a fascinating irony. What ended up happening was after getting her letter read to me by my social worker gave me her phone number and said, this is up to you guys now. It's time for you to take the reins and figure out how you want to connect. But in that letter that my social worker was reading to me from my biological mother, she said, my birth date is, and the date was the very next day. So here it is, my social worker's reading my birth mother's letter to me the day before her birthday, and she's handing me basically the keys to the kingdom to say, here, go contact her as you see fit. And so I spoke with her over the phone that very evening, and we had really what I would call an instant connection. I mean, there was a rapport, there was a forgiveness, there was a gratitude, and there was a match in our energy and sort of how we thought about the world. It was just amazing. And what she revealed in that conversation was that she was also in federal service. She was working as a librarian in the federal government. And she revealed to me that she was working only 2 blocks away from me. I was at Department of Health and Human Services, and she was 2 blocks away at the Department of Transportation. So knowing that, I decided, since it was her birthday the next day, I'm going to surprise this woman at her office. And that's exactly what I did. So I went through security, and I'll always remember this moment. I said to the security guard, I'm here to see Ann Sullivan. And she said, well, what's her phone number? And I'm in my head thinking about everything that's going on. And I said, well, I don't know her. I don't know her number. I've never met her before. And I'm thinking, okay, the security guard's going to think I'm some kind of security risk. I should clarify what I'm talking about here. So I said, it might interest you to know that she's my birth mother. And this is the first time I'm ever meeting her. And the security guard looks up from her desk and she, like, her face brightened. Think about this. This security guard has seen person after person come through this door. It's like the most boring job probably ever. And now this guy's walking in who's looking for his birth mother for the first time. She dials the number and picks up the phone and she says, there's a Mr. Davis here to see you. And the guard gasps and she hangs up the phone. And I looked at her and I was like, why did you gasp? And she said, because she gasped. And I knew then that that was the moment. It was real. The guard puts me on the elevator. She says, go down one floor, turn to the right. Her office is down at the end. Well, the guard has called Ann, and Ann has gotten up from her desk, and she's coming to the front desk to get me. So I'm on the elevator. I had picked out my suit, my tie. The reflection of the door is a mirror for me, and I'm straightening myself up to make the best possible first impression. And the door opens, bing, and this woman is standing in front of me. And I'm looking at her, and my face is on this other person. And I was astonished. I couldn't believe it. And as she's standing there, she's looking at me like, oh my God, that's him. And I dove on her. I gave her a huge hug, burst out into tears. And when I pulled back, I'm looking at her and I'm astonished. And I said, happy birthday. She smiled and she laughed and she was crying. And she said, this is the best birthday ever. And so we went out to lunch and we had an amazing time. I wish I could tell you I hung on every word she said. I can't tell you a single word she said because I was just staring at her going, oh my gosh, I look just like this woman. And so thankfully we had an amazing relationship. About 30 days after that, we sort of kept our relationship quiet for a moment and we allowed it to just be her and myself. After about 30 days, I invited her over to my house and she got to meet my son, her grandson. She had never had any other kids. It was just me. And she had me via C-section. So every day of her life, there was a mark on her body that reminded her that I'm out there. So she comes over to my house. She's never had any other kids, never any prospects for any grandkids. And now I'm introducing her to this guy who basically was the catalyst for this whole thing starting. And she comes to the door and I called him over. I said, hey, Seth, come here, buddy. I want you to meet Grandma Ann. And he hides behind my leg. He's maybe 2.5 years old, very cute, maybe 3. And she leans over to see him behind me and he leans the other way. And she leans over to see him behind me. And they started this game and it was like I wasn't there. And I was like, oh, this is going to be great. And the two of them, they look alike too, which was astonishing for me as well. So I had a really great reunion with her in that way. I did get the chance to ask her. She told me she was an open book. She says, ask me anything. I said, well, who's my biological father? And she drops this guy's name. And I sensed the pain in her voice when she said it. Like the story had an undercurrent that I said, you know what? I'm good right here where I am. I don't want to hurt her by finding this person because I can't not tell her that I found this guy. So I said, you know what? And to be honest, she said he didn't want anything to do with me once I told him I was pregnant. So I said, I don't need to know this dude. He didn't want to know me then. I don't need to know him now. So I let the whole thing go. And about 6 years after I met her, unfortunately, she passed away. And I was thankful for the time that we had together. But I realized I can't hurt her now. And I am curious about this other dude. So I tried to find this guy. And to cut that piece of the story short, I found him and I didn't really like him. There was no connection. I had this amazing connection with Ann and no connection with this dude. And I decided I was going to let the relationship die. Turned out he ends up sending me a letter in the mail one day that basically says, I'm not the guy. And I was like, I kind of know how these things work. And she said that you were. So I don't understand how you know this. But my wife said, it was like seeing a kid who found out basically like that Christmas wasn't, Santa Claus wasn't real. Like there was a deflation in my face, she said. But I said, you know what? I had a great relationship with her. I'm not going to worry about it too much. And so I went ahead about my life. And coincidentally, my mother-in-law is also adopted. So that meant we didn't know part of Seth's history on his maternal side because she's adopted. So we started doing ancestry DNA. We get our DNA results back one day, and I had already done 23andMe with Anne, so I wasn't super interested in my results. I had gotten the ethnicity and all those other things already. So when their results came, I was really interested in seeing the results for them. But as I was looking at their results, Ancestry DNA was presenting data and information in a way that I wasn't used to from 23andMe. So I started to dig into my own results, and I started to look through the family relationships. And as you probably know, they rank the relationships in relative closeness to you, parents and children, first and second cousins, aunts and uncles, et cetera, on down to third, fourth, fifth cousins. And I'm looking at the first level, and naturally I would expect to see one connection, me and Seth. But there were two. And I'm looking at this other connection, and I click into it, and it says, blah, 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 centimorgans in common, like this massive number. And in quotes, underneath this guy's initials, it says, WW is your father. And I was like, I can't believe, I wasn't even looking for this dude. And he just pops up in my DNA. How lucky am I that he had done DNA too? So I went through a process of trying to find him. It turned out that he was a genealogist. He had been seeking his own family information. And in doing so, he had connected with a white part of our family in Kentucky that had previously owned a plantation. And they had embarked on a project to try to understand more about all of these Black connections that had shown up in their DNA. So they were reaching out to family to try to find out how far out the family had extended, which was part of why his DNA was online, because he was contributing to the building out of the tree, which was incredibly lucky and fortuitous for me. We happened to be flying to California the day after I spoke with him by phone for the first time. And we had a wonderful conversation. I didn't like the first guy. This second guy was kind of cool. I was digging this dude. And I said, you know what? I'm going to be in California. I know he lives in Las Vegas. His name is Bill. And I said, Bill, I'm going to be in California. I'll be in your neighborhood. And he said, yeah, why don't we talk? Let's see if we can connect. So we took a day trip from Los Angeles to California. I took my wife, Michelle, my son, Seth, and we flew into the airport, and he was sitting right on the adjacent baggage claim to where you would have picked up bags if you had some from our flight. This older Black guy sitting by himself. We were a little late getting down to the carriage, the area. And I said, I think that's got to be him. Walked over to him and I said, excuse me, are you Bill? And he looks up at me because he's sitting down. I'm standing up. And he doesn't say a word. He rolls over and he reaches in his back pocket. He pulls out his wallet. He pulls out his ID and he looks at it and he says, looks like I am. I said, this guy's funny. So we had an amazing visit with him. And one of the great coincidences of meeting both Bill and Anne is both of them were genealogists. So when I met them, I'm not even kidding you, like a full familial history all the way back to the days of slavery on both sides of my family. And that's not something that a lot of people get. And so I felt incredibly fortunate in my adoption reunion experience, and not everybody gets that. And here's how I started to learn that was I started telling my story. My story, it probably sounds to you like a Hallmark made for TV movie. And it's a tearjerker. There was a while where I couldn't even tell the story without crying profusely. And it ended up that I would tell other adoptees what my story was. And I'm like, now you tell me your awesome story. And they would be like, well, I hope I can find my birth certificate one day. I was born in New York, and I've been to the room where the birth certificates are held, and New York's laws keep those birth certificates closed. And unfortunately, I don't know how I'll ever find my biological mother. Or I found my biological mother, and unfortunately, we just had a terrible relationship, or she didn't want to talk to me. And it was this speaking about adoption reunion with other adoptees that helped me realize that this narrative that in many ways I had lived, adoption is this amazing thing that happens to people and you should be thankful for it, wasn't always true. And that there were aspects of adoption that were incredibly challenging. And I like to use the sort of analogy that it's not an analogy. I like to use the phrases, you can have an awesome adoption and an awful reunion. You can have an awful adoption and an amazing reunion, and you can have every variation therein, because they change. They start off as amazing reunions sometimes, and they turn terrible. Or people start off very closed off, not willing to be, a contributor to reunion, and eventually with time they come around and you develop a relationship. So it's been a journey to sort of explore what it is for an adoptee to experience adoption from their various lenses. And so in speaking with all of these different adoptees about their different journeys, I realized, you know what, there are a lot of stories to tell, and they're not always going to be awesome. But I think it's important that we get these stories out there. And so I was very fortunate to be driving along one day. I'm listening to a podcast, and I said, that's it. I can help other people tell their stories of their experience in adoption and their attempts to reunite with their biological families. And that was really the genesis of the Who Am I Really podcast. So I've been doing this for 4 years, since 2017. I left government in 2017, and I've been doing it ever since. And I've spoken to over 150 adoptees, and I have a queue of adoptees waiting to speak with me on this show to share their own stories that will take me out probably to 2023 with enough seasons. So there's a gang of adoptees out there that want to tell their stories, and I learned something from every single one of them. And I have sat with some, and and anybody like you probably have done here, your mind wanders when someone's talking too long and you think, I know where this is going. And it was always at that moment where I was speaking to an adoptee about their story, and I said, oh, I know what's about to happen. And they said something mind blowing. And that helped me understand exactly the fact that everybody's adoption story is very, very different. And one of the things that I was saying to Betsy before we started this piece tonight was that you could have taken Damon Davis from Columbia, Maryland, and plopped him into the center of New York City, into the heart of the Deep South. You could have put me in a town in the Midwest that was all white and I was the only black kid. You could have put me anywhere on the planet and I would be a different guy than the one that you know now. And that's kind of the oddness of adoption. And I joked with Betsy that it's like a carnival game. Have you ever seen that Plinko game where you hold the disc at the top and it goes down and it hits the nails and it bounces all over the place and hits the bottom? That's kind of like what adoption is. You take this kid and you drop them into some parents, and then they live in a certain place and they have a certain religion and a certain socioeconomic status and this and that and the other thing. And that's the person you get. They are abused or loved or any of these other factors that contribute to how a person's life unfolds. And, the sort of adoption Plinko game can be very crazy because some people end up in a really sweet spot that, has a number 500 at the bottom. And some people end up in an awful spot that ends up with a 0 or a 2. And I always feel for those people who end up in those challenging spaces, because some of us are very well equipped to deal with the tragedy, the trauma, the drama, the anything on that side. And some of us are not. And that can impact how an adoptee ends up dealing with the situation that they're inserted into. So that's kind of how I started the podcast, was having spoken to a bunch of adoptees about their own experiences and recognizing that they're all so drastically different. It's important to bring them all to light. So I started interviewing people, and I interviewed, my very first guest was my best friend, Andre. It was an amazing show. It was a great experience. I was glad to do it with somebody that I knew and trusted. And that allowed me to really, sort of spread my wings, reach out to other adoptees and invite them to start, sharing their own stories. And I find that the adoption the adoptee voices movement has really just grown tremendously as people have discovered that they can sort of express themselves, and that there is a cohort of people and a community around them that'll say, yeah, me too, I feel that as well, or I'm really sorry you feel that, but I'm here and I will support you. I find it to be really, really interesting. So one of the things that I wanted to sort of chat with you about tonight is some of the stuff that I've learned from interviewing, over 150 people on the show. And it falls into a couple of categories, and I'll just run through them quickly because I want to save some time for us to do question and answer and have some discussion if it works for you guys. One of the things that I learned personally when I first started speaking to other adoptees is something you probably know, but it bears repeating because it's something that not everybody arrives at, excuse me, immediately. And that is that abortion and adoption are not two sides of the same coin. And there's a lot of adoptee conversation that happens in, Facebook groups and things like that, where adoptees will say something along the lines that aligns with abortion versus adoption, and the community will correct them. But the community corrects us because we are in it together. What I find doesn't happen is the narrative has not changed outside of the adoptee or birth mother or whatever community. And so someone who is not an adopted person might say something like, well, you should be glad you weren't aborted. And that's a very, very sensitive thing to say because it's not the same thing. There's the decision for the child to have a life or not. And then there's this decision whether you will parent the child or not. And there's not enough understanding outside of the adoptee community about that. And I made that mistake very early. And I'm so thankful for the person who corrected me on it. And it was very enlightening because I was like, yeah, you're absolutely right. Those are two completely different things. So another thing that I found interesting is there's a lot of feelings of abandonment in the adoptee community. And I've recently come to realize that a decision to place a child in adoption is not an abandonment. When you abandon something, you leave it by the side of the road or in the trash or what have you. And that is not what I have experienced most biological parents have done. They may have been coerced into a decision to relinquish a child. They may have been forced. They may have thought that they could not care for the child, but ultimately it was a decision to place the child in a different place. It wasn't, in my opinion, an abandonment as much as you need to go over here in order to have the life that everybody else thinks you should have, or that I don't think I can give you, or whatever. So my point is, I would love for folks to try to relieve themselves of feeling abandoned, because I don't think that's the right word for what happened. That's my opinion. Another thing that I would love for adoptees to try to do is fight the fabrication of a narrative in your mind. It's hard though, because what happens is, as an adopted person, you try to imagine what's out there. Who are your biological parents, and where are they? Where do they live? Have I seen them before? Why did they give me up? All of these things, and your mind needs something to attach itself to. But we end up creating worst case scenarios most often. Pardon me. And I would love for people to have the resources to try to let go of those fabricated narratives, because they're most often not true. We end up, as I said, creating the worst stories about being unloved and unwanted and given away and abandoned and things like that. And I think until you have the chance to actually hear from someone who was there and was part of the decision as to why you were relinquished, try not to let yourself think of all of the awful scenarios, because it doesn't serve. Something else that I'd love for people to think more about also is empathizing with everybody across the adoption continuum or in the constellation. So there are adoptees, birth mothers, birth fathers, adoptive parents, siblings, there are social workers and policymakers and judges and all of these people. And we often pass judgment on things that happened that we weren't present for or didn't have a voice in, but also we don't take time to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. And oftentimes adoptees to biological parents. And so I think similarly, when we start to pursue reunion, it can be very challenging to start to stop and think to yourself, all right, what is it going to mean for me personally if I find this other parent and they accept me or they don't? And what is it going to mean to my adoptive parents if I find these people and they accept me or they don't? And will they accept that I'm interested in trying to make this journey or not? And what is it going to mean to my immediate family if I find these people and I want to be around them all the time? Like there's all these calculuses that we're not able to make. And it can be challenging to slow down and think clearly about what it is that you're getting yourself into. And one of the things that I've found on the show is I've spoken to many adoptees who have said, I was glad reunion happened at the age that it did, because if it happened when I was younger, I probably couldn't have handled it. And a lot of times those are adverse scenarios, but I think there's a lot of knowledge and wisdom in recognizing that you weren't mature enough to accept nor deal with what was coming at you had you been 18 in reunion versus, say, 34. So there's some value in that empathy of sort of understanding how your actions impact other people. Another thing I think is really valuable too is adoptees need to find their outlets. And Betsy and I were talking about this before we started here. A lot of what we experience, we carry with us, and it's bottled up. You don't talk to anybody about it. You may not have a community of adoptees that you have an outlet to share things with, and it's bottled up. You carry it with you and it eats you alive. And I want to see people be more open and expressive. Come on podcasts and talk about your story. One of the things that has been so interesting to me is that so many adoptees have come on and said, Damon, it was so cathartic to actually tell my whole story to another adoptee who understood what I've been through. But I think that there's other outlets. Not everybody wants to sit up and talk about their story. Expressing your emotions, either with a therapist or on social media or wherever you decide, with your friends, wherever it is, let it out. If you're an artist, a songwriter, a poet, if you just want to write down and journal your stories, my point being, get it out because it's eating you on the inside if you're not talking about it, expressing it, admitting what your challenges are, what have you. So I highly encourage that. And I think that therapy is a great outlet for that. And I'm hopeful that we'll see more adoption competent therapists come into the universe as we find more and more adoptees coming out and expressing themselves about what they've been through. And then my final point, really, and it's obvious, but it bears saying, is adoption is a lifelong experience. It's not just a moment in time that happens for a person in a family. It's something that you will live with for the rest of your life. And it comes and goes in and out of your life in many instances. There are days when adoption is at the forefront of your mind and you're thinking about reunion or how reunion went or what you did right or what you did wrong in reunion, what have you. And there's times when you're not thinking about adoption at all. And I think of things like a late discovery adoptee who might not know that they're adopted and they've gone 10, 15, 25, 45 years more and not knowing they were adopted, and suddenly adoption appears in their life and they have to reevaluate everything that they ever were. There are folks who have attempted reunion at an early age and never found anyone, and they sit with that. There are others who have sought someone out and found a grave, unfortunately, and so they will never get the answers that they had hoped to obtain. There's so many things about the adoption experience that are out of our control that I just feel like you can never really escape it. It is always going to be a part of you as a person. And I think that once many people sort of sit and come to grips with that, you can start to work through the process of understanding who you are as an adoptee a little bit better. So those are some of my sort of top findings. I could go on and on about speaking to adoptees because I love it. It's my podcast. It's my passion. It's the thing that I love to do. And I love to interview people, and especially about something that is so personal to myself. So I'm hopeful that I shared a little something that was of interest to you. And Betsy, I'll turn it over to you, and hopefully you've got some questions that you want to ask. So thank you guys for listening.
Well, thank you, Damon. Wonderful words of wisdom. And I love those themes that you shared and the lessons learned. When you mentioned your first one, when you mentioned about abortion and the oversimplification that I think many people in our society, use that analogy or that comparison. You generated a lot of comments in chat, a lot of positive comments in chat. Say it again louder for the people in the back.
Yeah.
So, I think, that's something that we've all had to deal with. And it's oversimplified. It's used against us politically. I think a lot of times when we're seeking information about ourselves, or it feeds into the "you should be grateful" narrative. There's all kinds of things that I think get under a lot of people's skin and more on that. So thank you.
Of course.
We should have a program just about that, maybe. So
I think it would be valuable because there's policy differences in the two. There's emotional differences in the two. There's family structure differences in the two. I mean, I think that would be really fantastic.
We also had a comment in the chat that wasn't really a question, but I thought I'd share it with you because I know you were talking instead of chatting, that your point about the narrative and letting go of that fabricated narrative. Somebody put in the chat that she feels it's a lot easier to let go of that narrative if one's adoption experience was a good experience.
That's probably true. That's probably true. I have the luxury of doing that, and any trauma is going to stay with a person, and it's hard to let go of something that is scarring you deeply. I admit that fully. It's easy for me to sit here and say that because I've got a story that sounds like a movie. But I've interviewed some folks who have had just some horrific stories of abuse and neglect and things along those lines. And I can see how it would always be with you, far more than my experiences with me on a daily basis, that would be with you potentially for a long period of time. I recognize that.
I hope, even for people who have suffered that type of trauma, that they can find a way to channel that into creating change and, for themselves and for others. A lot of people have told me over the years that maybe I started Adoption Network and have done all the work that I've done and worked on the access to records legislation, et cetera, because my reunion was a good one. And my response to that is, it's, to me, it wasn't about good or bad or indifferent. It was about the truth. And I had to be at that point in my world where, whatever it is, I just want to know.
Well, I think similarly, I mean, if you could make an argument from a podcast, right? I had a great reunion. Why would I start on a podcast to talk to other people who didn't have a great reunion? I want all of the stories to come out because it is enlightening to me to know that my reality is not everybody's reality. And and that they are so drastically different. And I think we all learn from each other when we open up and discuss in candid ways with the emotion and the ugly stuff that these things happen, be they, abusive, neglectful, and there's positive stuff in there too sometimes. I think there's just so much that's important about telling all of these stories because they are so nuanced and drastically different.
Yeah. Well, thanks. So we did have a few questions that people submitted ahead of time. And one was about your adoptive parents' feelings about your reunion and how you managed that. You touched on that briefly, but could you say a little more?
Yeah, I definitely abbreviated the story. So an interesting component of my story was, as I said, my adoptive mother was beginning to suffer her deterioration mentally. And that was obviously incredibly emotional for me. We were very close, and we were battling by the time I figured out there's really something wrong here. And one of the things that I was grateful for was that she had always said to me, if you, pardon me, if you ever want to search, I'd be happy to help you out. That was at a time when, forgive my words, she was more mentally strong. And thankfully, even though she had suffered a mental deterioration, when I came to her after I reconciled in my mind that I was looking for this biological mother for the right reason, I was looking because I wanted to find her, not because I wanted to replace her. When I got to a good spot with that reconciliation, I said, I'm going in. I'm going to ask mom if she'll help me by sending me the information that she has. And thankfully she did. And I was eternally grateful to her for that. But I will say, in more direct answer to the question, she had always told me she would help me. And so I trusted that. And I was thankful that it was still there when her mind was deteriorating. My adopted father was less emotional about it. He was going through a bunch of other things, both health and financially and other things at the time. And it probably wasn't on the forefront of his mind, because there's this interesting thing that happens is I was looking for my birth mother at the time, and I wasn't looking for my birth father, which in some ways in a person's mind could have accidentally have been a competitor to him. This is the guy that could have had my spot had I not been his adoptive father. You could see how there would be potentially some challenge there if I had found my biological father first and said, hey, I want to introduce you to my adoptive father. So I found my biological mother, and my adoptive mother was not capable of meeting her because of her mental incapacitation. I found my biological mother got to meet my adoptive father, which was cool, but they weren't, and forgive the words, competitors. They were not in the same spot in terms of parents. And then, unfortunately, my father passed away, my adoptive father, and then I met my biological father. So there was never any crossover of introductions except for the biological mother to my adoptive father. But thankfully, everybody seemed to be, for lack of better words, cool with what was going on. But I didn't have to live with the ongoing, relationship building with my biological mother while trying to manage a relationship with my adopted mother, because she was not available. So I didn't have to deal with that challenge.
Thanks. That's helpful. So we had two questions that were submitted that are more kind of comments, but I'll pose them to you to see what comments you have to their
Sure.
comments. So one is someone who found her birth mother at age 51, had an ongoing long distance relationship, and then felt that there was an out of the blue kind of misunderstanding that, should have been maybe trivial, but ended up taking over and ending up cutting off their communication. And so this adoptee was talking about feeling very angry and I think let down, if I'm paraphrasing, almost given up again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that it could be characterized as secondary rejection, even though it's not at the outset of I found you and then the person says, I don't want to meet you. That's that classic. But there's the secondary rejection that happens at different times, I believe. And one of the things that came to mind for me as I was thinking about what you were saying, this person's experience is I feel like sometimes people are looking for an out, an excuse, a reason. If it's too stressful to be in this situation, and the first thing you do, I'm out of there, right? And it feels like, and I should probably also say, these relationships are very tenuous. You didn't grow up with this person your whole life, so you kind of know them, know how they think, know how to approach them on everything, know how they will interpret stuff, and vice versa. They don't know how to express things to you. So you're building, communication that should have happened over years in an adult relationship that is very young. And I could see how there could be some miscommunication that would allow a person to say, oh, I'm out of here. You took that wrong. I'm done. But it also reflects on that person's inability to sort of stop and think, oh, wait a minute, maybe I said that wrong. Or I could see why they took it differently than I meant it, because they're coming from this adoptee perspective where, and this goes back to what I was saying about empathy, perhaps she doesn't understand this, that, or the other about me. So point being, I feel like potentially, and I don't know anything about the situation, but the sounds like the birth mother could have given up more easily than perhaps they needed to. And there's, some classic communication challenges there that, are present with best friends and spouses and parents and kids. Like, that's just classic communication issues. But it's unfortunate that the birth mother gave up as easily as she did. And I'm always hopeful that time will heal wounds and people will say, that was in the past and I was irritated about something else at that time. And I'm glad you came back, here 3 years later or whatever the thing is. So I'm hopeful that time will heal the wound and the person can sort of reestablish some kind of relationship with the birth mother.
Thanks. Yeah, I think as adoptees, we're primed to be very sensitive to loss. And, so especially repeated birth family loss, but really any kind of loss that comes up for us maybe hits us a little differently than someone that hasn't had that past experience.
Yeah, it does.
So we had another person who shared an experience around finding her birth family, sounds like close to 20 years ago. And unfortunately, they're Facebook friends, but they don't really have a lot of interaction. In fact, some of her family live local. They get together for family reunions, but this adoptee isn't always invited. Just feels, other from her birth family, and that's obviously a painful experience.
Yeah, that can be really tough. There's so many challenges in this. I find adoptees can sometimes end up on an island by themselves, right? Because elements of the adoptive family are thinking to themselves in the back of their mind, you're not really one of us, right? And there are elements of the biological family sometimes that are like, you haven't been here this whole time. I don't need to know you at this point. And so you end up standing in the middle of the room by yourself while these two camps are over here sort of cavorting with each other and leaving you out in the cold. And it's got to be so lonely for folks who have that experience. And, to a certain degree, I've had that too. But I'm always encouraging folks to try to find other really deep connections. They don't replace, but they add value to your life for those relationships that you don't get in your family. And it's also funny to me because I've got people that I feel like are like brothers to me, and we are not in the same family, but that connection, excuse me, is very important to me. And I think that there are a lot of relationships that we try to force in either one of those families that sometimes don't need to be forced. But on the other side of that, we do feel a sense of needing to belong to a group. And the first group that you feel like you should belong to is the family. And when they don't include you and stuff, you're just like, where do I go? So I don't want to oversimplify, just go replace it with friends. It doesn't work like that. And that can be very, very alienating for someone to experience this, disconnection from their adopted family and potentially not have any connection with their biological family either. It's very hard.
Yeah, thanks. There was a series of comments in chat discussing that it really wasn't allowed for adoptees and birth parents, and I would say even adoptive parents to some degree, to really process the losses in adoption, or the trauma, the grief. And I think that's taken its toll on a lot of people. And so a lot of times when we're trying to come back and have that connectedness and that relationship, it's sometimes with some unresolved issues on the table still.
Absolutely. The number of adoptees that I've spoken to on the podcast that have told me, I found her, we connected, but in my opinion, she never got through the trauma of what happened to her when I was born and relinquished. And I've had people say all kinds of different things from, you know, she's damaged from that time. She never processed what happened to her. She's still, and forgive my words here, you know, still an immature person who's still back at that time in her life. Like all kinds of things, you know, these traumas manifest themselves in different ways. And I'm by no means clinical, so don't take this as an analysis of anybody's, you know, position in mental or on mental health. But the idea that something as dramatic as carrying a child, delivering that child into the world, your body has changed in order to welcome that child into the world. And that child, and I'm speaking obviously of an infant adoption in this instance, and that child is relinquished off to somewhere else, and you're not allowed to talk about it. And you're supposed to go back to school, go back to work, go back to your life. And nobody said anything about this massive thing that just happened to you. That is crazy town. I have stubbed my toe in the house and had people ask me if I'm okay. And you're talking about having a child and nobody wants to talk about it? That is bananas. It's unfair. It's not right. And people deserve an outlet to go ahead and let that come out. And I think one of the challenges, so I'm 48, one of the challenges for mothers of a certain age who, you know, could have been my mom is that time is so long gone and you've lived an entire life up to this point. And now here I come and you have to go back and relive all of that stuff. This goes back to the empathy thing that I was talking about previously. If I have lived at the time 36 years on this earth and you gave birth to me a long time ago, and my birth mother, when my letter arrived in the mail at her house, that whole experience came flooding back, right? And she was forced to face it again. If she had gotten over it in any form of fashion, now it's all back. And if you had any level of, again, forgive my words, positive experience, a decent experience, a humane experience in adoption at that time when you may have relinquished a child, you may be in a better place. For anybody who had a very, very traumatic experience, I could see how it would be incredibly difficult for this person that you relinquished 36 years ago to come back. And now you have to rehash the story. I got to tell you what happened to me. I haven't talked about this with anybody or very few people or what have you. So it's so tough. And on top of that, that person that's coming back to you is looking for something. I want to know you. I want to see if I look like you. I want medical information. I want a relationship because my other relationships were horrible. Whatever they're looking for, the parents have to deal with, as well as their own grief, trauma, what have you. It's an incredibly challenging situation.
Thanks. Yeah, I think for many birth parents, there's a sense of like time stood still, you know, that emotional time for that piece of their world, but there was no way to process it with so much denial imposed in the situation. So I do that repeatedly. Well, we have time maybe for one more question. I was going to ask you about themes of reunion, but I think we've covered a lot of that. How about foster care adoption? Have you had the opportunity to interview?
I haven't, and I would. This goes back to something that I said earlier. I have not, but I feel like that could be a great place for someone who has that lived experience to start their own podcast about that, right? Because I was adopted as an infant and I grew up in a family that looked like me. So my experience was not that of a child who is potentially transplanted from place to place, and that feeling of not belonging at an early age. And when do I get to go home? And is this my home now? And some of those things, I don't feel it's my place to try to invite that conversation. I would love for someone who has that lived experience to do that. The same way I see my colleague Diane, I see my colleague Yvonne on the call here. You know, Diane, I keep saying Diane. Why is that? Because Jennifer Diane Ghostin is there, and I want to talk about her too. Props. So I keep calling Yvonne Diane because I want to talk about both of them. But each one of them has stood up their own podcast. Yvonne is a birth mother, and she's starting a podcast called Birth Moms Real Talk. I've interviewed birth moms twice on my show. One, where I said at the end of the show, I would love for a birth mother to start her own podcast and interview other birth mothers about their experience, because it's not my place. I've never given birth to a child. I've never relinquished a child. I can't do it. Yvonne contacted me after that episode and said, I'm glad you said that because I've been thinking about this for quite a while. I'm ready to do this. So I've been working with her on starting what she's calling Birth Moms Real Talk. So y'all should watch out for that. Also, though, I talked before about expressing your own, letting it out and expressing yourself and doing whatever you want to do to sort of get your story out as well as get other stories out. So Jennifer Diane Ghostin is here. She started Once Upon a Time in Adoptee Land. That's another adoptee focused podcast where she's talking with other adoptees about their experiences, but she also did a sort of audio drama of her own experience as it was written in her book. So people are trying to find creative ways to get their story out as well as invite others to tell their story. So I just wanted to give a shout out to Jennifer and to Yvonne for their work to try to bring more stories to light in a different way, because there's so much to be said. There's so much to explore. And there's so many people that are so awesome at doing it. And I'm really excited for all of the stuff that's coming from other people that are doing things to support the adoptee community.
Good. Well, thank you so much. We could go on for a lot longer, but it is 1 minute to 9. So I'm going to wrap things up. I did put links in the chat for everybody to be able to find your podcast and your book and find out more about you. And I thank you so much for sharing so much of your personal experience and so many lessons learned and words of wisdom as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your work too. I really appreciate the invitation to be here. Thank you everybody for joining. It was really great to be with y'all.
Just so that everybody knows, Adoption Network is a nonprofit organization. We are membership based, and I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't ask you all to join. So you can check out our website for that. We do have through each month several, we just call them general discussion meetings, and those are adoptee, birth parent, and adoptive parent discussion groups. So a podcast is great to listen to things, and then it probably brings up a lot of feelings, and this is a great place to come and process. We also have a birth mother only discussion group for anybody who's interested in that. So please visit our website and learn more about us. And thank you all for being here tonight. Thanks again, Damon.